students of Elgin High School. It's a wonderful thing that I think you guys are doing, and I'm super honored and excited to be a part of it. So I'm a paleontologist. I work at the La Brea Tar Pits in Los Angeles, California. And my interests involve using data from the past to help us inform conservation efforts today. So starting with a picture of Africa, this is a photograph. It's actually a compiled series of photographs that were taken over about 26 hours at a watering hole in Africa. And it has a lot of the iconic vertebrate species that you see or that you think of when you think about Africa today. And what I'm going to show you is that Africa really represents a natural ecosystem for the Cenozoic, that's to say for the age of mammals in the past 50 million years or so. And pretty much every other ecosystem on Earth has been disrupted from this natural ecosystem. And this is something that we only know when we look to the past. We're living in an impoverished world. Between about 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, the vast majority of large mammals on Earth became extinct. This image shows large mammals that were living in North America at the end of the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago. And the pictures in green at the bottom are the only ones that are still alive in North America today. And this is a pattern that held true for other continents. South America lost more than 80% of its large mammals. Northern Eurasia lost a huge number of large mammals, and we don't even know what was lost yet in South Asia and other less studied areas. Australia lost about 88% of large mammals. There used to be giant wombats, larger kangaroos, and giant birds as well, other species that that disappeared during this time period. And again, the only continent that didn't appear to suffer these sorts of extinctions at this time is Africa, which is the only ice-free continent that still retains the large majority of its large mammals. Now, we know from paleontological research that mammal biodiversity today is lower than it has been for at least the past 30 million years. And we can trace this decline in biodiversity directly to the loss of large-bodied animals from global ecosystems during this time period at the end of the last ice age. For instance, at the La Brea Tar Pits where I work, we have fossils from 5 big cats that used to live here in Los Angeles. The American lion, which is one of the biggest cats that ever lived. The iconic Saber-Tooth Cat, some people call it a Saber-Tooth Tiger. Scimitar cat, which is another type of saber-tooth cat, an extinct subspecies of jaguar that used to live in North America, and the mountain lion. And of those 5 cats, the only one that's still alive today is the mountain lion. And that is coming under increasing threat. So this event, which is collectively known as the Ice Age extinctions or the Pleistocene extinctions, or sometimes the late Quaternary extinction event, is something that's been of intense interest to both archaeologists and paleontologists for more than half a century at this point. And there's been a lot of debate in these communities about what could have caused such a great departure from what was the natural ecosystem formation for millions of years. So what caused the extinctions? Well, there were 2 major things that were happening at that time. First of all, we were coming out of the last ice age of the time period that's called the Pleistocene. So over the last 2.5 million years, the world had repeatedly become colder with the polar ice caps expanding. At its peak, half of North America was actually covered in ice sheets. And then those ice sheets would contract and things would warm up again. And so some scientists believe that it was this rapid fluctuation in temperatures that was happening, the last major episode of global warming, that caused these animals to become extinct because either their populations were stressed due to the loss of habitat owing to ice cover, or because during the warming periods, there's evidence that forests were expanding and fragmenting these open savanna habitats that a lot of the animals were adapted to. And also with the yellow arrow towards the left of the graph, you can see there's this period called the Younger Dryas, which was this very rapid cooling event that happened in the middle of a warming. And some scientists believe that it was this sort of rapid change in temperature that caused animals to not be able to adapt fast enough to survive. Now, we know here this is just a handful of the organisms that are threatened by modern climate change with extinction. The pika, which may be the first mammal to go extinct due to global warming, because they live at high elevations, and as the climate gets warmer and warmer, they're being pushed higher and higher until at some point they just won't have anywhere to go. Chinstrap penguins in the Antarctic are being squeezed by climate changes and the expansion of populations of other animals. Sea turtles have at risk due to disruption in their nesting behavior. Aardvarks are starting to die off due to increasing drought length. Polar bears, of course, the most iconic symbol of climate change and global warming today, who are having to venture further and further out into unstable ice in order to find the food that they need to survive. And of course, coral reefs, which are experiencing major bleaching events, and there are estimates that a great number of the corals in the world may disappear within the next few decades. And it's not just animals. There's also, I put in the Joshua tree, which is a plant close to where I live. There's even a national park named after it, Joshua Tree National Park. And within a few decades, there may not be Joshua trees in Joshua Tree National Park anymore, just like there may not be glaciers in Glacier National Park anymore due to global warming change. But there was something else happening at this time, which is that the extinctions from the Ice Age coincide very closely with the spread of humans across the world. So humans were moving out of Africa and into Europe and Asia and Australia and eventually into the Americas. And a lot of the extinctions we see appear to coincide pretty tightly with the arrival of humans in these habitats. And humans can have various impacts when they come into a new ecosystem. There's the idea of hunting, where of course they encounter a new food source, and humans being very efficient hunters with technology and culture and communication are able to destroy large populations of animals much faster than any other sort of predator. And also humans have indirect impacts on fauna when they enter ecosystems through their modification of habitats. So that when humans first enter a new place, one thing that they often do is set fires to clear big areas of forest. And so these can result in habitat disruption and other indirect impacts on species that live in these places. And we know that there is evidence of hunting of some of these extinct large mammals, or megafauna as we call them, by humans, especially mammoths. And just as there is increasing impact on the planet today from human activities. And we also know that human activities today, such as deforestation, the spread of cities, and the fragmenting of natural habitats is increasingly impacting animal populations. And when we look to the past, we see that these large mammal species started to decline at about the same time that human populations started to increase. And so this is a graph from a paper that a colleague of mine published years ago, tracking the number of large mammal species in the world against the estimated human populations at the time. And they appear to be pretty closely linked. And then there's another theory. So while scientists have been arguing for 50 years that either humans or climate change had killed off these iconic extinct megafauna, there's sort of an emerging understanding that there may have been an interaction between these two factors that really was the ultimate driver of the extinctions. So, for instance, the human hunting may have been more detrimental to the animal populations if those populations were already stressed from climate changes. And there's starting to be increasing evidence that the habitats as the Earth was warming at the end of the Ice Age, in some areas were becoming uninhabitable to species before humans arrived there. And so what's starting to emerge is a picture of landscapes that are being increasingly fragmented by changes in the environment, into which you have a novel, very efficient predator that's humans coming onto the landscape. And so these populations were already much more vulnerable when humans arrived. And we know from present day that human modifications of ecosystems, such as habitat fragmentation, make it much harder for animals to respond to climate change as they naturally would through migration. And we know that this is happening today. For instance, there are wildlife reserves in Africa where some of the animal species are not going to be able to live for much longer because of the changing climate. And under conditions thousands of years ago, those animals would have just moved to a more habitable place, but they can't do that now because there are cities and highways and farmers who don't want them trampling their crops and all sorts of dangers. And the only way that those animals are going to survive today is if we physically put them into trucks and move them to new wildlife reserves in more habitable areas. And this sort of process may have happened in the past as well, where humans were coming and fragmenting landscapes, and so animals were no longer able to migrate between areas that were formerly habitable. So, if all this sounds familiar, then you may be right, because it looks like this process that happened, this major extinction event that happened 10 to 20,000 years ago, was actually the beginning of the biodiversity crisis that we find ourselves in today. So the megafauna extinction, instead of being viewed as a separate event that has nothing to do with what's going on today, is probably just the first and most vulnerable species going extinct in a process that is continuing and has been continuing throughout over the last 10,000 years and is still continuing today and into the future. So these are showing the map on the left shows where mammal species have gone extinct since what we consider to be the end of the Ice Age extinction. So over the last 10,000 years around the world. And then the graph on the right, the map on the right, shows where mammals are in danger of becoming extinct today. And this map shows on a global scale how mammal and bird populations of species that are still living but maybe in danger of going extinct have declined over the last few decades to a couple of hundred years around the world. And one pattern that we see is that the animals that have been going extinct seem to follow a pattern with regards to body size. So the animals that went extinct during the Ice Age or the Pleistocene were largely the biggest mammals from the ecosystem. Animals that have been going extinct more recently in the last few hundred to few thousand years tend to fall into a middle body size range. And the animals that are now threatened with extinction are the few remaining large large mammals as well as the sort of medium and smaller sized mammals. And most of the mammals that are not threatened with extinction today tend to be small. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what is lost when we lose these big animals from an ecosystem, because it's not just the presence of the lions or the elephants or the giant sloths or the horses that disappeared, but these animals, because of their large size and because of the roles that they play in these ecosystems, are have disproportionate impacts on the environment in which they live. So this picture shows on the left shows what habitats look like with and without certain large mammals. So at the top, on the right, you see what the ecosystem looks like when that large predator is there. And then on the left, you see what it looks like when it's absent. And you can see in all four cases, the fox, the jaguar and cougar, the wolf, the wildebeest, there are significant changes in an ecosystem once a predator has been removed or reintroduced back into the system. And this image on the right is a picture taken from the same place in Yellowstone National Park following the reintroduction of wolves into that ecosystem. And you can see that when the wolves come in, because of the role they play in predation and the impact on the deer and elk populations, they actually end up having a huge impact on the plant communities, which in turn impacts on smaller animals, birds, rodents, etc. So, and this has been measured in a number of places. So, for instance, in Africa, when large wildlife, elephants, wildebeest, are removed from ecosystems, you see significant changes in the presence of small birds, mammals, even insects. You see changes in the interactions between plants and animals, and you see changes in ecosystem function as well. For instance, in the in nutrient dispersal, in seed dispersal, which affects where plants are growing further afield, in the decomposition of organic material, in the removal of carrion and dung, in the effect of trampling, in erosion, in carbon cycling, in the fire regimes, in pollination. So there are huge impacts that are caused by losing large mammals from ecosystems. So what can be done? Now, I know you're hearing across this month from many people that are doing great work in conservation biology and trying to sustain biodiversity today. And as a paleontologist, you wouldn't necessarily think that we have much to say about modern diversity. But in fact, we do, because when we look at the past, we can learn things about how ecosystems operate and have operated for thousands or even millions of years, and then we can apply that information to understanding how to conserve species today. So, for instance, we've one thing that we're looking at right now at the La Brea Tar Pits, where I work, is understanding how plants and animals and entire ecosystems have responded to past climate changes before humans were here. So again, that period from about 25,000 to 10,000 years ago contained the last major episode of global warming on this planet. And so if we can look at the past and see how plants and animals responded to that climate change in the past, that can help us understand what we can do to help preserve animals and plants threatened by climate change today. So make predictions about where they might need to move, where we need to start creating new wildlife preserves where we need to create migration corridors so plants and animals can safely get from where they are now to where they're going to need to be in 10 years. They can we can also make decisions about what species are going to be most threatened by climate change and allow us to allocate our resources properly there. We also can learn from looking at the past about how ecosystems have responded when particular plants and animals have either come into a new ecosystem, such as happened when humans arrived in the Americas about 15,000 years ago, or when they've been removed from ecosystems, such as when the mammoths and saber-tooth cats and wolves and giant sloths and the American landscapes around 13,000 years ago. We can also look at how, during this particular time period that I study, how human and climate impacts may have interacted to drive extinctions, and in a way that we can help sort of predict and mitigate the impacts of humans today. And finally, we can understanding how ecosystems have operated over really long scales can help us determine what our conservation goals can be. So, for instance, as I mentioned, there are national parks that are big ecological reserves in North America that are going to lose some of their iconic species as climate change progresses. And so understanding how those ecosystems have been assembled and operated over thousands or millions of years can help us as we plan to manage these ecosystems today as they continue to change. So I was going to just leave the rest of it up for questions and answers. I thank you so much for listening, and I'm very happy to answer questions and talk with anyone. So if anyone wants to write a question in. Okay, I have a question from Bridget. It says, what drew you to this field? So that's a great question, and I haven't actually always been a paleontologist. I actually started out as a marine biologist. I used to scuba dive for work. I've worked in the northeastern United States. I've worked in Antarctica. But the questions that really drew me were always how do ecosystems work? How do plants and animals interact with one another and with their environment? And so I used to study this underwater in modern ecosystems, and now I study it in the past. And I was looking for something that was a very integrative and interdisciplinary field, because that's something that I really enjoy, is sort of solving these puzzles of, oh, well, there's this body of knowledge here and this other body of knowledge, and where do they intersect and how do they fit together? And I had always been intrigued by the past, and I'd worked on, I had the opportunity to work on some archaeological excavations, and I was very interested in, what was it like before, either before humans or before, our modern societies were here, and sort of this almost detective-like mystery of the past. And so when I realized that you could ask these sort of ecological or ecosystem scale questions in ecosystems that didn't exist anymore, that was what was really, that was when I knew that was what I wanted to do going forward, was to be able to look at these types of questions that a lot of people are studying in modern ecosystems today, and see how they operated in the past, and then see how that could be used to help us understand our future. Rhiannon wants to know more about the extinct large cats from one of the first slides, and I'd be very happy to. I can go back to that. So these are the 5 cats that we have here at the La Brea Tar Pits, and they were living here in Los Angeles between about 11,000 and well, at least 50,000 years. That's about as far back as our record goes, but I'm sure they were here before. So the saber-tooth cat, the second one from the left, it's the second most common large animal we have. We have about probably at least 2,500 of these animals that were found in the tar pits. And one thing we think we know about them is that they were ambush predators. So based on the way they're built and based also on the types of injuries that we see occurring in their bones, we think that they probably, they would sort of hide somewhere behind a bush or maybe even in a tree, and then when, say, a bison or horse or something they wanted to eat came by, they would leap out and attack it and wrestle it to the ground. And they probably used those large teeth to cut into their veins to kill the animal when they were pinning them down with their large forelimbs. One other thing we think we know about these cats is that we think they were probably social. So very few cats today live in groups. In fact, of the large cats, the only ones that really live in groups are the lions. You know, you think of a pride of lions that lives together and is together, and children together. But that's really pretty unusual. You know, tigers are pretty solitary, cheetahs are pretty solitary, mountain lions are pretty solitary. But we have evidence from the fossils that the saber-toothed cats probably lived in groups, probably hunted together in packs, and probably even took care of one another if one member of their group was injured and couldn't hunt for itself. It looks like other members of its group were probably taking care of it. The scimitar cat, we have not very much material here, but there's a ton of fossils of this cat from a cave site known in Texas. And at that site, it looks like it was a den. It was a cave where you would have a family group of scimitar cats. So, you know, at least mother and cubs, because we find adult and also a lot of baby scimitar cats in this cave. And it looks like the adult cats were bringing in baby mammoths for the baby scimitar cats to eat. So that's something that is pretty interesting. So we can learn not only how they lived, but also the sort of things they were eating, because we find a lot of baby mammoth remains in the cave and a lot of the baby and adult remains. And the mountain lion is a very interesting cat. So there was a study done on these on 3 of these cats from the tar pits. So the American lion, the saber-tooth cat, and the mountain lion. And what they found in this study was that and the mountain lion. And what they found in this study was that the American lion and the saber-tooth cat had pretty restricted diets. They seemed to be eating a sort of limited number of things, whereas the mountain lion was much less picky. The mountain lion was eating a lot of different things. And we think that maybe one of the reasons that the mountain lion didn't go extinct, that it's the one that's still surviving today, is because it was sort of flexible and adaptable. And so when conditions changed here in North America, it was able to, and all of the large animals that the bigger cats were specialized to feed on went away. The mountain lion was able to switch to smaller food sources. And so we know today, they eat deer, they eat rabbits. There's one that lives in the big park in the middle of Los Angeles that actually stole a koala out of the Los Angeles Zoo and ate it. And so they're quite flexible eaters. And that's something that we were able to learn from the past that can actually help us understand what species are probably going to do better in the face of global changes today. Why did they measure amount of dung in large animals, and what can they tell us? So dung can tell us a lot, actually. It can tell us what animals eat, of course. You can look at what's in the dung and also look at the molecules in there that we call isotopes that help us understand what animals are eating. And one nice thing about it is that that's something that you can compare, dung in the past, which we call coprolites, fossil poop, and modern scats. And so you can look at, were animals eating the same types of things in the past that they're eating today. And we've found fossil poop from giant sloths, both in North America and in South America, and scientists have actually been able to go through and identify the individual species of plants and found that certain species of sloths were eating up to 80 different kinds of plants based on what they found in their coprolites. There's a colleague of mine who's looked at coprolites that are, I don't remember, maybe 20 million years old from carnivores that used to live here in the Los Angeles area and has found crushed up bone in them and was able to determine what size of animal those animals were probably eating. And then if you look at poop today, so the one I mentioned in this talk was looking at the removal of large mammals from the system today, and how that changes. And so this was looking at, if you take out the large animals, how does that affect, say, populations and things like dung beetles? And that's important because dung can carry a lot of pathogens in it, and so if you don't have a big enough population of large animals producing large poop to support the animals that get rid of the poop, then you have the poop piling up, and that can be really toxic, and that can to the ecosystem. Something else that we learned from the specifically megafauna poop, the coprolites of the big animals from the Ice Age, is there's a particular type of fungus that grows on poop. It's called Sporamiella. And people have been able to look at Sporamiella when they've been looking for pollen in, say, sediment cores of lakes, and they've been able to use the disappearance of the Sporamiella fungus from those sediment cores to determine when megafauna populations probably went extinct or became very, very small during the end of the last ice age. So that's another interesting application of the poop study. Brittany M says, can you explain the graphs in your one slide a little more? I'm interested, but they're a little hard to see. So I'm not sure which graphs you're asking about. So I can explain each of them if you want. So I think this is probably the first one. So this is showing the climate or temperature on Earth, and specifically this is looking at an ice core from Greenland. And so what scientists do is they can core into ice, and by looking at again the isotopes of oxygen that are trapped in the water molecules and the air molecules in the ice, they can figure out, well, specifically in the water molecules in the ice, they can figure out how cold it was and how much ice was present on Earth. And that's because there's two types of oxygen. There's like a heavier oxygen and a lighter oxygen. And lighter oxygen tends, because it's lighter, it evaporates more. And so the lighter oxygen is more likely to evaporate and then get rained down or snowed down, and then evaporate and then get rained or snowed down. Now, when it's fairly warm, you have the lighter oxygen, it evaporates and then it just goes back into the water because it's coming from rain. But when it's cold, it evaporates, but then it because it's cold, it comes down as snow and it gets locked up in ice and it never goes back into the water. And so when you are looking at the oxygen molecules um, uh, in ice cores or in a particular type of fossil of a marine microorganism we call foraminifera, and you can count them if you have more of the lighter oxygen molecule, you know it's warmer, and if you have less of them, you know it's colder. And so that's how they figure out, as one of the ways that people figure out what the climate was like in the past. And so this graph is showing the last 17,000 years or so of climate. And so um, uh, it was pretty cold until about 15,000, well, until about 16,000 years ago, and it started getting warmer and warmer. And then it went down again quite rapidly, which is the time period we call the Younger Dryas, and then it went back up again very sharply into the climate that we have today, which is what we call the Holocene, although some people are now arguing that we should say we're in a new epoch called the Anthropocene, which is the age of humans. This graph is showing the migration of humans out of Africa and into different continents of the world and the time that it happened. So we have evidence of human fossils and human artifacts in the Middle East about 100,000 years ago, in Europe by 40,000 years ago or more, in sort of northern Asia about 25,000 years ago, in Australia by about 50,000 years ago, and not in the Americas until quite recently. We were the last area where humans came to, and they arrived here about probably around 15,000 years ago. And the oldest human evidence we have south of sort of the Alaska Yukon area is about 14,500. And what's interesting is we also have the oldest site in South America is also years old. So probably humans were migrating down along the coasts, and in that way we're able to get to South America. Let's see. This graph is showing the populations of large mammals versus humans. So you can see as starting about 100,000 years ago, um, you know, there's not too much of a decline. There's a little bit of a decline when humans arrived in Australia about 50,000 years ago. A little bit more when humans arrive, start migrating into the Americas. But right after humans get to the Americas, you have this very big drop in large mammal species. And at that time around the world, human populations are as well. And so you see humans starting to sort of replace other species as making up most of the mammal life. So it's maintaining, you know, a similar amount of biomass of large mammals, but it's a major decrease in biodiversity because you're losing overall hundreds and hundreds of species, and you're only replacing them with one species. And then these figures are showing mammal species that have on the left that have gone extinct during the Holocene. That's to say, after the Ice Age or after the Pleistocene. So over the last 10,000 years or so, areas where mammals have gone extinct, and then and the blue dots are, you know, where only a few mammals have gone extinct, and the red dots are where lots and lots, you know, more than 20 different species of mammals have gone extinct. And the one on the right is showing where where on Earth species of mammals are threatened. And again, the blue dots are, fewer, maybe, 20 species that are threatened in that area, and the orange or redder dots are many more. The red dot is an area where about 150 are threatened. And then this is showing just decline in populations. So where you haven't necessarily had species go extinct, but instead of having big populations of particular animals that are, interconnected and covering a broad area, those populations have gotten much smaller and have become, more fragmented. And instead of having maybe thousands of individuals, you hundreds. So, and this shows you sort of the areas also um, where those populations are. So the Amazon area has suffered a lot. Other parts of Central America, Africa, South Asia. And then this is just showing the average body size of mammals that went extinct during the Ice Age. Is in red, went extinct after the Ice Age, so in the Holocene or the Anthropocene. In orange, ones that are currently threatened in yellow, and ones that are not threatened. And as you can see, we're moving down the body size spectrum as we go. So the biggest things were the first to go extinct. The next biggest things were the next to go extinct. The next biggest things are the most endangered today, and the smallest things are the ones that are safest today. I think. Oh, and then these graphs are showing changes in different types of different proportions of species of animals and different types of functions in ecosystems once you remove large animals out of that. So you have, when you take large mammals out, you have an increase in effect maybe of other species and a decrease in some. You have a decrease in some interactions between plants and animals, so say herbivory and parasitism, and an increase in others. And then this is a little bit of a clearer representation of that, showing when you have low numbers and high numbers of megafauna in modern ecosystems, how that affects feed dispersal. So if you have a lot of, so for instance, if you have a lot of megafauna, a high number of megafauna, you have a high percentage of seed dispersed. And when you have a low number of megafauna, you have basically no dispersed. So you same thing with removal of carrion or dead organisms, dung removal, herbivory, and carbon cycling. They're all much higher. Are there any other questions? This last slide, this is a picture from a tar pit It's not actually the La Brea tar pits. It's another. The question, how big are the tar pits? That's a great question. So where I work here at the La Brea tar pits, they're not that wide. So it's an area where we Los Angeles actually sits on top of a number of oil fields. So there's oil around. We also have a lot of earthquakes. So when those earthquakes happen, sometimes cracks open up in the ground and some of that oil seeps up. And so that oil, when it comes up to the surface, and some of the lighter parts of it evaporate, what's left is this like heavy, sticky substance that's asphalt, which is sort of colloquially referred to as tar. And so that spreads out on the ground, but it doesn't, at each individual place where it's seeping out, it might cover only, only the size of your classroom. It's not really that big, but just a few inches of that is sticky enough that it can trap a mammoth or a bison or a horse, because it's really, really impossible to get out of when you step into it. And so what happened at the tar pits over thousands of years is that once in a while, one large animal would be unlucky and they would end up getting stuck in one of these asphalt seeps, and they wouldn't be able to move, and they might die of dehydration or starvation, or other animals might see it. So carnivores might see that animal trapped and try to eat it, and often those should often get trapped as well. And so that's why at the La Brea tar pits we have the opposite of it's like an ecosystem planet. So normally in an ecosystem of Africa, right, you've got lots and lots of elephants and wildebeest and zebras, impalas and apes, and then you've got a much smaller number of lions and cheetahs and such. Well, at the tar pits, we have the exact opposite of that. We have a much, much higher number of carnivores than we have herbivores. So we have 5,000 direwolves, we've got 2,500 saber-tooth cats. We've only got like 35 mammoths, and so it's an interesting place that was sort of because of the way that it got trapped here, where one animal gets stuck and that would attract a large force would also. Any more questions? You're welcome. What topics are you currently researching? That's a great question. So we've got a lot of questions that we're working on right now. So I personally have worked in South America for a very long time, and one of the projects that I'm working on right now is looking at on the scale of the whole continent of South America, when humans arrived and how their populations grew there, when the large mammals, the megafauna, went extinct in the different parts of South America, and how that coincides with the climate changes that were happening, and specifically how the plants were changing and the ecosystems were changing. And so that's a big project that a whole team of us have been working on. over the last few years is trying to look at it and say, okay, well, are different large mammals going extinct before others? Are certain regions of South America losing, having their extinctions happen before or after other regions of South America? And what does this say about how, the combination of climate change and humans have operated in this case and what they operate today? Another project that we're doing here at the tar pits is using the fossils from these deposits we have that are between 30 and 50,000 years old. So before that major episode of climate change, to reconstruct ancient food webs and how these different plants and animals were interacting with the ecosystem. So another thing that's really unusual about this field site here is that we have a representative a lot of different components of the ecosystem. So it's very unusual in paleoecology, a site where you have this together at the site, because these are sediments that preserve to dissolve plants, and the type of sediments that preserves plants tends to dissolve bone, and so it's very unusual to get them together in the same site. But we have that here because the asphalt, the tar, preserves both of those things, and so we're able to look at what plants were here and what animals were here and figure out, who was eating what, and then we're trying to reconstruct the whole food web, at least as far as the plants and mammals go, to figure out, how stable those food webs are through time, change, and if there's any kind of prediction based on looking at how those were, before all that major change started happening, to say, okay, well, after the climate change and human arrival, like what things out of that food web survive. So that's so those are a couple of the projects that we're working on now. We're also just starting a project to look at sort of change through time in several of the different big animals we have here. So the saber-tooth cats, the dire wolves, the coyote, the horses, and the bison, and looking at as the horses and the bison, and looking at as the climate was changing, do we see changes in their diets, or were some of them leave the area at certain survive here? But how are these animals sort of adapting to changes? Any other questions? You're welcome. Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate everybody's questions, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and the other speakers. And thanks once again for inviting me. I appreciate it.